welcome to another episode of In Conversation With, an initiative started by This Can Happen ambassadors to talk about all things mental health. I'll be your host today, and my name's Harpreet, and I'm joined by three incredible human beings. We have Jessie, Sylvia, and Anita on the podcast today as well. Now, with it being the month of March, everybody was talking about International Women's Day and how women face certain issues with regards to their mental health. And we thought, why not delve deeper into gender? And by gender, I mean the stigma, stereotypes, and expectations that are placed on people from a young age throughout their entire life. Now, gender is a big topic, so we thought we'll narrow it down just a little bit and talk about women's mental health and how men can do more to support. So today we will dive deeper into that topic, and I'm not going to take much more of this time because it's a huge topic, so we can talk for quite some time. So we'll just dive straight into it. Now, to begin with, every one of us has foundations, and that foundation is normally linked to our sort of childhood and upbringing. So if we come to Jessie first, Jessie, could you just sort of elaborate a little bit about your upbringing, so your sort of family environment and potentially school as well, and how that had an impact on your mental health?
Thank you, Harpreet. So I'm Jessie, and I am half Filipino and half Welsh. I was born and raised in the Philippines and came to the UK when I was quite young. Something that I was first of all, I was diagnosed with depression and severe anxiety from the age of 6 years old. But it wasn't until my adolescence where we discovered actually that I was suffering from something called cultural identity issues. And that had a lot to do with my upbringing, being raised in, I'm very lucky, a diverse household. Being raised in a diverse household was really great, but at the same time, it can be quite alienating. And I was raised with amazing parents who taught us what they were taught, which wasn't necessarily appropriate for the new generation that I was in, which was feelings make you weak, and you won't get far in life if you lead by your heart, which was difficult for me growing up because I've always been a follow your heart kind of person. And so it meant things like the usual things that you deal with growing up, being in a new environment, that factored in with being of a different skin color to everybody else in the classroom, made things really difficult. And I couldn't speak to my mother, who was very much raised in a no feelings allowed situation. School, mental health, I'm only 29, but mental health when I was younger wasn't talked about. And so again, there was not a lot of support growing up.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for sharing that. Could I ask, was English your main language at home?
No. So my first language is Tagalog, which is the national language of the Philippines. My mum spoke it fluently, but my dad didn't. And my dad had children who were Thais, who were predominantly Thai speaking. And so when we came to the UK as a family for the first time, we had to suddenly speak English. We weren't allowed to speak our native languages. Now, as a kid, I didn't speak a word of English when I came to the UK. So that further alienated me, and I think contributed towards the depression and anxiety.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for being so open about that. And I guess language is the first thing when you're a child.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine what it's like being in a place where you don't understand people, especially kids of your age. And I do actually remember when I was growing up in my school, there were so many people that had come from a different country to settle here, and they didn't speak the language either. And just making friends with people was challenging, from the beginning as well. So thank you very much for sharing that. So definitely cultural dynamic, and when it comes to talking about your feelings, you've got culture and language to sort of navigate through as well. So Anita, if I bring you in at this moment as well, are you able to sort of dive into the topic of childhood and tell us a bit about yours?
I suppose it was a tale of two halves, and there was a lot going on as a child which affected my mental health. There was various sort of traumatic experiences. And then that had a knock-on effect, I suppose, as I became a teenager. and sort of my approach was to kind of keep everything inside, and there wasn't really words or space to kind of speak about things. And I suppose it was a case of just, you know, get on with life and sort of carry on and those sorts of things. But then my mum, she trained to be a counsellor, so she started to do a counselling course, and she was very much about talk about your feelings, be quite open, and she championed kind of going to therapy and things like that. So I started from, you know, as a late sort of teens, going into therapy. But in terms of sort of mental health, as a child growing up, I was very quiet. I wouldn't really talk much at school, and it was a challenge for me for making friends. So I was very almost reclusive and challenged in the way of, you know, how do I develop relationships? How do I communicate? So everything stayed in here. And I suppose as I got older, it manifested and it started to come out in different ways. And although, you know, I had the support from my mum in terms of, you know, talking out and talking about your feelings, everything was still very much kept in my mind and wasn't really shared as much. So it was interesting growing up, and also to Jessie, mental health wasn't ever spoken about growing up, and you don't really hear, and unless it's kind of in hush hush, you know, such and such person is struggling, and it's not something that you talk about. And I suppose I come from a sort of Indian Sikh background, and again, there's cultural aspects where you don't really display or talk about or be open if you're having struggles. It's everyone's doing well and everyone is seen to be doing well. So those sort of aspects played into it as well. And also, I suppose, cultural expectations that being, you know, a young girl, you're kind of very sort of active in the home and doing things, and you know, so there was different elements which I suppose were drawing on and impacting my mental health in different ways.
So you mentioned friendship there as well. Sort of a question that came to my mind there is that, you know, did you not have any friends, in the sense that, you know, how sometimes you get groups and then they always have that quiet one that tags along. So did you have that type of group, or did you have the case where you were very much isolated because you didn't talk, nobody kind of wanted to, you know, have you in their circles at the time?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. So I was actually, and I can joke about it now, but it's sad to think about that. I used to kind of hang out with a dinner lady because I struggled that much to interact and engage with others, that it was just easier to be with the sort of trusted adult almost. So I mean, yeah, there were times I had one close friend, and that was kind of all I could manage most of the time. But growing up, it got a little bit better. But even as a teenager at school, I was very quiet, and again, only had maybe one or two close friends who I would open up to. And yeah, I found a group to tag along with, and managed to do that. But yeah, I think sort of earlier years quite reclusive.
So obviously your mental health had an impact in terms of you just generally making friends, and you know, as kids, if other kids do not understand what you're going through, they just feel that you're okay being alone, when in actual fact you perhaps could have done with a friend then at that age as well. So thank you very much for sharing there, Ania. Selby, if I bring you in next, then, so could you, how was your sort of childhood and your mental health as a child?
My childhood was horrific. Brought up in a dysfunctional family. I was basically fed, clothed, housed, watered and educated, and that's about it. That's it, end of. I never felt parental love, never felt kindness or tenderness. It was just get on with it. I was never encouraged, never helped. There was no warmth or tenderness or kindness. Put down, berated, abused, bullied, teased. Had no friends because of where we lived and the structure of our family. So yeah, it's pretty rough, really. There was some things that did happen in my childhood that, from a human development point of view, from my mind actually shut them off completely, and I didn't actually had no memory, no recollection of them whatsoever, until there was a TV program about 20 years later, and it triggered something. And I always felt different. I always felt odd. I was labelled an enigma when I was at school. but no one ever did anything about it. Mental health, the terminology wasn't even there when I was growing up. No one even talked about health or physical health and mental health. It just wasn't there. And then in my sort of 20s, there was a TV program, and it just triggered a lot of the stuff that had come up that had happened in my childhood, which is then part of what many people have heard me talk about before, this personal perfect storm. And then sort of my mental health deteriorated really, really rapidly. So it wasn't the best of childhoods.
Obviously, very sorry to hear that. You're a wonderful person now, and the enigma bit to me sounds very fascinating. I think that's if you were an enigma in my school, I would probably want to get to know you a bit better. But the question, to sort of like elaborate more on that, do you feel your life would have been any different if you were perhaps a boy?
I don't know, because in your initial thing about any expectations of me as a girl growing up, there weren't any expectations of me growing up at all. It was just a case of just get on with it. My father got me a job in banking when I was 18, and no one said no to him. There were no expectations in my family, irrelevant of whether you were a boy or a girl, or any other. There was just none whatsoever.
And did you have any sort of school friends that perhaps were shining beam of light? Nothing like that at all?
No, there was no friends, because where we lived, all the kids in my school lived in a completely different area to me. And even at 9 years old, I used to sort of travel to school on the bus, and then get home on the bus. And sometimes there was no one indoors. So friendships, really, that didn't even come into play either. And it's one of those things that you don't actually know what you don't know, and you can't actually miss something you've never had. So that was just the way my life was. That was it. Yeah.
It's quite sad to hear, obviously, because you do sometimes hear of households not being that great, but then generally the school is that light in terms of the friends and the teachers. But if you don't have either in either of those environments, it is, like I said, quite sad to hear. The question that I asked about, would your life be any different if you were a boy? And if I just bring you in on this, because I'm intrigued to know if you have a slightly different answer to that.
In a way, yes, because I think culturally growing up, where in an Indian household, boys are given a different expectation to the girls. The girls are almost seen and not heard, and actually even don't even be seen, kind of blend into the background, get on with doing stuff. And as the oldest sort of daughter, there was more, it wasn't even said out loud or vocalized that you need to be doing it. I took it on board myself. But in terms of the difference in boys and girls, boys are given more freedom to be themselves, to speak out if they need to speak out, be free in terms of going out and meeting friends and having that level of freedom, as opposed to being a girl. It's very much about being protected, and I think that almost stunted me in able to have a voice, and being heard and being seen. So now, as I've got older, it's very much about, I want to use my voice as much as I can, because I wasn't able to as a child or as a teenager or as a young adult. So it is very much about, and I very much, I don't agree with the cultural expectations of women and girls, and I do speak out about it a lot more, and there is very lot of discrepancies and imbalance of equality. So it is actually something I'm quite passionate about.
Brilliant. I'm glad to hear it. I grew up with three sisters, and I, even from a young age, I knew I was treated a little bit differently. But the way I saw it was, it's a win for me. I didn't really see it as it's a huge loss for their perspective, because you're absolutely right. The voice gets taken away, and when the voice gets taken away, that can only impact you mentally speaking. And then when you grow older, it has a huge impact as well. And before we move on to the next session, Jessie, again, would your life be any different if perhaps you were a boy?
Actually, in my case, not really. My parents, I don't know if it's because I came from a blended background, but my father had a son and he had 4 girls. And so he was very much girl power, but also boy power. However, on the flip side of things, my mom came from a very strict Filipino background where men did come before women. And so we got very conflicting lessons growing up, where my mum was very similar to Anita, saying, girls should be seen but not heard. We're meant to be passive and accepting. Whereas my dad would counter her in a loving way and say, no, my girls will learn how to stand up for themselves. So gender at least in my household, really didn't play a part in how we were treated.
Brilliant. I'm glad to hear it, that, that your dad was such a sort of a beacon of light fighting for gender equality, during that period as well. You mentioned girls should be seen but not heard. And, even now, if somebody hears that and thinks it's, it's a thing of the past, it's really not. A lot of the sort of gender-based jokes that we hear now are about women talk too much and they need to be silenced. And sometimes you come across jokes, and the jokes are talking about silencing women in violent ways as well. And so one of the things as a male ally I try to do is, even if I see it and it's a meme, I call it out. I think I ask people to think deeply about why this is meant to be funny. But yeah, so lots there. And when we delve deeper into sort of childhood and expectations, especially if you're a girl, about making friends, about having a voice, all these type of things, you can't help but wonder, if everybody knew just a little bit more about how this could impact children when they grow up, and if they had a little bit more compassion and understanding of mental health, and society was in a better place, then how different our lives would actually be. That's not to say that there's anything wrong with yourselves. You're all wonderful people. But given a choice, I'm sure you will agree, I would rather not have any sort of difficulties or trauma as a childhood, because we have to carry that for the rest of our life. And we see it through parenting that sometimes that trauma, as much as we try, it does get passed on to children. I want to sort of take this conversation.
There's also a generational thing. You see, I was brought up, my parents, I'm older than the three of you, and my parents came from a very different background. So it really was children should be seen and not heard. So irrespective of gender. So, there's a generational thing too there that's, and it's breaking the chain, breaking the cycle, that it's not, things move on. But that's really the background I came up. Children should be seen and not heard, and that was it, end of.
Yeah. I think some parents just aren't ready for the amount that children do actually talk. Jessie, were you going to come in there?
Sorry, I just wanted to add another thing, is that, and I'm just speaking purely from a mixed background, is that something that I wish I'd said earlier in my bit was that something that impacts a lot of people who not necessarily has a blended background, but maybe they've moved countries, that people who've lived in their country or lived in the same country don't quite understand, is that when we have to try and fit in to the new culture, we then become alienated from our original culture. And whilst it's really lovely to think that we could blend it, I've come to the situation where I don't fit in with my Welsh peers because I don't look like them, don't have the same, background. Then I also don't fit in with my Filipino side because I'm now considered too Western to be Filipino. And so that, I think, has a massive impact for people being able to identify or understand their identity. But yeah.
That's a really great point. Identity is key, and I to some extent I felt that as well when I went back to India. I was very British, and when I'm here I'm very Indian, and so you're kind of in this limbo state where you're neither here nor there. And again, from a mental health perspective, who are we actually supposed to be? And childhood can be a tricky period because you're navigating your way through life, trying to get a personality, trying to become somebody, but you're not sure who you are. Before we move on to the next bit, you mentioned culture there. And I think one key point to mention with culture is sometimes we always look at culture as, sometimes you can think that this one's bad and this one's good, whereas there's good things and things for improvements in every single culture. And so, it's important to tell kids that, you don't just label one higher than the other. Culture it's not a competition, right? Which culture is actually the best? We look for the great things that can help you in every single one. I just wanted to take the conversation now on to sort of work life, because, once you're a kid, you grow up and then you have to work. Such is society. But you spend a lot of time at work and you interact with a lot of people, a lot of customers, potentially, if you're in that type of role as well. And that can have an impact on your mental health. And it's only recently, and I say recently, given how long humanity has been working for, that women have really been allowed in the workplace. And now we're seeing more and more that women are getting jobs that they never got before. Even in my workplace, there's a regional managing director now, and it's the first female regional managing director, and it took till 2022 to get there. So many strides are being made, but at the same time, there are still some barriers in the way for women, which can affect their mental health. So Ania, if I bring you on this one first, did you want to sort of share a bit about sort of work life for yourself?
Work life for me has been interesting for one reason or another. I've been in worked at various companies at different stages of my life. And I suppose it's been in the last, I'd say sort of 12 years where I've been going through a lot of my personal challenges that affected my mental health, and how that kind of played out at work. And, I worked to somewhere sort of 4 or 5 years ago, where I worked there for 3 years, but probably had a total of about 8 months off at different periods of time because of physical health reasons and mental health affected as well. So yeah, I took time off because I was diagnosed with endometriosis, and I had a number of operations and surgeries, and that obviously had a big impact on my mental health as well. So I was taking the time out from work, sort of dealing with having this sort of illness and reoccurring surgeries, and that had its toll. And I think it was always the fear of, oh, I kind of feel bad that I'm going to take time out from work because I have to go off and have a surgery, or because I'm struggling mentally. And it's always that guilt, I think, that builds up, that, and you almost try to almost end up turning it on yourself when you stand back and you think, oh, actually, I didn't choose for this illness. I didn't choose, to be physically unwell, mentally unwell. And it's just the way it is. And just taking that time out. And over time, I got used to it. I'm like, okay, I have to just do it. I can't feel bad about it. And I tried to be as open as I could with my manager, so that it wasn't such a big thing about having to tell him if I need to be off again. And I remember I'd had so much time off, and then I was having my end of year review, and I had to go off again for another surgery. And he was kind of talking about, you've got so much potential, and we know you've got so much more to give, and because you've had time off, you haven't had the opportunity. And I became really tearful, and I got really upset that actually I have to go off again, and it was such a big burden that I feel like my career is being impacted. And even now I talk to my husband sometimes that I feel I could have progressed further had I not had these challenges and had to have so much time off work. And he kind of has to remind me that be kind to yourself. You have had a lot happen. So your mental health, your physical health, and my mum passed away almost 12 years ago, so that was a massive shock and big thing to deal with. So yeah, I think it's trying to be easy on myself that, okay, I haven't gone and progressed as much as I hoped, but there are reasons behind it. And hopefully I hope to do different things in my career and aspirations.
Yeah, so you mentioned endometriosis there, which is a clear example of women not being taken seriously in healthcare, right? So you always hear the same story, that I've had pains for so long, but the doctors kept saying it's fine, it's perfectly normal, that being in pain is natural for a woman, even severe pain. And one of my friends had it as well, and it wasn't until she collapsed that they realized it was endometriosis, and they found that I think it was a buildup the size of a golf ball near her sort of ovaries as well. And it wasn't until that point that they started to take it seriously. And it's an absolute shame, because why can't we have these conversations? And it's almost like a two-way thing. Women are sometimes conditioned not to talk about these things, and men are conditioned to not being able to listen to these type of things. And given that a lot of men, I know it's changing now with the sort of gender balance, but a lot of men will be in positions of power. They will be hiring managers, line managers, and if they're not aware of these things, then they might not be able to deal with it. So it's great that your manager was so supportive and still saw you for your potential and not you as a nuisance, because some managers unfortunately do that as it is. There's a question I was going to ask, but it's completely slipped my mind with regards to that. But
yeah,
were you going to say something?
Yeah, and I think it's an average of 10 years for women to get diagnosis, and a lot of women will go to the doctors and get told, oh, it's normal to have painful periods. No, it's not. it's not meant to be that level where you're debilitated, where you're in bed and you can't walk and things like that. And I'm very fortunate in that my husband has private medical, so I was able to access that. But for those who don't, it can be a really long, hard journey. And I think the best thing to do is just continue to push your doctor to. All it can take is a scan to actually just look internally and see what actually we can see what's going on. And I got someone in my family who is struggling to even get a scan and is in a lot of pain every month, and there is something that needs to be diagnosed and picked up. But again, it's that the backlog and not being able to have the accessibility. So that was one aspect of my health. The other aspect I had going on when I was at the same time was going for IVF treatment and fertility treatment. Again, I chose to be open because I didn't want to be a barrier and make it more stressful when I was trying to get things done. But it is a massive taboo where women and also men won't talk about infertility for fear of judgment. And it's getting better, but again, like mental health, there's a long way to go in where people feel comfortable to be able to open up about these sorts of topics.
And you can only imagine the sort of how it affects you mentally. You're going through this and you want to talk about it, but some people aren't. So if I bring Sylvia onto this next. So Sylvia, in terms of your work life, I know you've had an interesting career. Would you like to sort of dive into that and how it affected your mental health?
Well, when I first started in banking, I absolutely loved it. It was brilliant because it was my escape, my therapy, my stepping away from all the stuff that was going on at home, and it was a place where I could park all the personal demons and escape from it for a while. So I absolutely loved it. It was fun, it was exciting, and also at the time, again, harping back to being a bit older, in hindsight, it was quite pioneering because at that time, our careers advice at school was being a typist, a secretary, going into social care, or being a teacher, or the armed forces. That was it. That's all the careers advice that we had. So when I actually went into banking, I actually went on to the admin and the ops side, clerical side. Out of the 100 intake they had that year, only 4 of us were girls, and I was one of them. So it's like, in hindsight, yes, girl power. But it was actually quite, empowering and exciting that I wasn't a secretary, not to decry what they do, but it was very, very different. And for me, working was fantastic. I absolutely loved it. And I ended up, throughout my career, generally working in a male-dominated environment, which brought lots of other things as well. But linking into what Anita was talking about there now, you would never talk about your monthly cycle. You would never give anyone any ammunition, any way that they could use as it to be a game or detrimental, or any way that you would open yourself up to being vulnerable. So things like that weren't talked about at all. So, growing up, you make sure that on those weeks when you're not your normal self, you might be a bit irritable, a bit grumpy, I was very, very aware of that, to make sure that my performance and my productivity was the same. But for me, working I loved it. It was a real escape. It was brilliant. But yeah, working in male-dominated environments, that brings an awful lot of challenges, let's put it that way.
Yeah, great. By the way, you're absolutely right. The way you sort of described that, you're 4 out of 100. It's like, yes, but it's 4 out of 100. That's 96 men that are being sort of hired as well. And it's interesting to know that obviously, you'd keep certain things to yourself, like for example, menstruation. During a lot of events that happened at NatWest, there was one, I think it was an external company that did it, and it was a talk called Vagina is Not a Dirty Word. And it was really trying to break the stigma around menstruation, menopause, and all the things that women go through, because as soon as you say menopause, some men think directly to genitalia and things like that, as if it's a really, really bad thing to talk about. But it's not. It's our bodies, it's our physical health, and it has an impact on our mental health as well. And we're all in it together, right? But it's interesting how sometimes it can always seem like a barrier, and that can affect your mental health as well. Jessie, if I bring you into this as well, we were talking about your your career before we press record as well. So how's work life been for you?
I'm really passionate about workplace mental health because I have been in a lot of different industries. I've been working since I was 13, and so I worked in many different roles. And I'm very much like Sylvia in that work has always been an escape for me, especially when home life didn't feel quite so safe. And sorry, nervous. So especially when the work life, home life didn't feel quite so safe, work's always been an escape. And I've always been a different Jessie at work to who I am normally. And I would find that work, in terms of managing my mental health, I've always brought my A game because work's always been more important than anything. Doesn't matter what's going on anywhere in my life, I will be, ready for work. Which has been quite difficult as somebody who has a lot of emotions. I was in an abusive relationship that I didn't know was an abusive relationship until I started going to therapy. And as a result of that, it made me very frightened. So when I moved to London and my ex-partner found out, I was subjected to probably several months of extremely worrying threats, especially with what was happening around London at the time with attacks happening. I took them very seriously. And so this kind of already my mental health in a bad way, this put me in a situation where I became essentially a recluse. I used to be very active, but there was about a 2-year period where I only left the house for work, and I would come straight home and didn't have a life outside of that. Now that resulted in me gaining a lot of weight, and at a previous workplace, our senior leader had picked up on this weight gain and told my colleagues how I was too fat for my job. Now, that caused a lot of bad mental health issues within me. But again, typical me, I suppressed, to the point where it took me into a really dark place. And I just took it as a norm because I thought, senior leader talking about me like this, first of all, I didn't appreciate that they didn't take into consideration, well, why did I suddenly gain a load of weight? Well, because I was no longer leaving my house. But I share this story because I recently started a new job with a company, and I use the word lightly, fell in love with my manager, because one of the first things that I said to her in my final interview was, I have a lot of anxiety regarding a situation that happened in my interview, and that is so not like me. I don't share my feelings with managers. And she turned around and she said, well, what can we do to make you feel more comfortable? And I'm 29 now, from the age of 13, in those years of working, I've never had a senior leader ask me what it was that I needed from them to make me feel comfortable. So I feel so good being able to have some kind of positivity. And my overall message really is that good workplaces do exist who care about you, not just as an employee, but as a person. And if you're not in one, I really recommend you look at what you're doing or look at your situation and see if you can find those good places.
I think that is incredible advice. I know it's easier said than done for some people. However, if you rule out leaving a workplace where in this case was abusive, then you're always going to be trapped in it, and it's always going to affect you in terms of your mental health. I think that comment from the senior leader is bang out of order. And I do find it interesting how those type of comments are disproportionately aimed at women. Women's bodies are always policed, always commented upon, like you're getting a bit fat, you're getting a bit thin, your hair's like this, you're dressing like this and whatnot. You tend not to get that in terms of men speaking to other men, but you do get it towards women. And from an inclusion and mental health perspective, not really making these comments is the way to go. Thinking about what's the benefit of you making a comment about somebody's weight? None. Don't make it again, right? But you're right, good workplaces do actually exist. And I think that's a great example of how you can go from a very low point to a really good point. And well done you for making that move. Well done you for saying that in an interview and talking about your feelings, and the stars aligned and you got a great line manager in that as well. So I'm really happy to hear that end bit of that. But I'm sad that obviously the start bit happened, but it's good that you're in a good place now. And it actually kind of leads us into the sort of final segment of this podcast, which is more about relationships. And relationships is, again, it's a loose term. It can mean friends, family, it can mean colleagues, acquaintances, but all our relationships impact our mental health. And so I wanted to sort of dive deeper into some relationships that impacted your mental health, and it can be positive or negative, entirely up to you, which you'd like to disclose. So Sylvia, if we start with you on this topic, how have some relationships impacted your mental health?
I think one of the biggest impacts on my mental health, apart from the relationship, when I was a kid, was my marriage. A little bit like Jesse's story. I got married, thought he was the world's best man, and it all started out really beautifully, and then over a period of time it deteriorated into what would now be called coercive control, but at the time you don't know anything about it. You don't know that, you can't see the signs because you just don't see them, and it's done very, very illicitly. It sort of creeps, and that's one of the worst things probably. My relationship with my husband at the time was probably one of the biggest impacts on my mental health. And in hindsight, knowing that my mental health wasn't in a good place to start with because of stuff that happened in my childhood, it wasn't very good at all. And it was really, and when we did actually split up, it was the split up, very acrimonious, very nasty from his side, and then how it deteriorated thereafter was probably the catalyst for my I call it my personal perfect storm. That's probably the trigger for it, but there was lots of other stuff underneath. It was that wasn't great. It wasn't great at all. Just don't realize it's happening.
Were there any relationships in your life that actually were really good for your mental health?
The one I'm in now, the partner I have now, to me he's like the best bloke in the world. He's absolutely fabulous. And you have that phrase, what would I do without him? But he is my rock. He is my everything. He's absolutely fantastic. And my point is, not all men are Watsits. There are some fantastic guys out there, and I've got one now. And
we have a little round of applause from the rest of the ambassadors there. Could you just sort of elaborate just on one thing that perhaps he does that all men could do better in their relationships?
He listens. He's a brilliant listener. And he also lets me rant and rave when I need to. And it's probably something from my childhood. He hears, he listens, and he believes, but he also gives me ideas as to how to deal with things. And he's just always there. If I have a rant and a rave, he's there. If I'm not, he's there. And I think that's probably what it is. And he understands, and he doesn't get angry when I have a bit of a rant and rave about something. It is supremely unconditional, and that's what it is. And we have individual lives, not separate lives. He does his thing and I do my thing, and we do some fantastic things together. He's interested in what I'm interested in, and vice versa. It's a relationship that I could have only dreamt of when I came out of the one from my previous husband. And for me, I could go on for ages, but I won't. It's just fabulous.
I can tell, yeah. But no, we'd love to hear it, and I'd love to meet him one day and with a notepad and pen and say,
yeah, exactly.
Give me some wisdom. But it comes back.
The thing is, if you asked him, he would probably say, I'm just me. And I think that's the other thing. We are both now very comfortable within our own skin. He's not trying to change me or do anything, and vice versa. We're just very comfortable in our own skin with each other.
That's amazing.
And ourselves, warts and all, as the phrase goes.
Being yourself, right? And I think some things come natural to some people, and like me, I know that some things don't come naturally, so I do try to work on them. But you mentioned at one point there that he listens, and I think comes back to the point we spoke about earlier, seen but not heard. Giving women a voice in a relationship is so important. Jessie, if we come back to yourself on this one, so relationships, again, it could be any relationship with anybody, and how it impacts your mental health.
So I, with the female people in my life, so very close people like my mum and my sisters, I love them to death, but so that I struggle a little bit to connect with them in that understanding of mental health, because I'm so obsessed with mine, or I'm obsessed with learning more about mental health and how to, my dream is to just try and make it easier for somebody out there. But they are going through their own journey with it right now, so I'm trying to be patient with that. My dad and I, we've not always seen eye to eye with things like mental health, but I have to admit that in the later part, the saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, my dad is completely opposite that, because now that I've started speaking out about my mental health and my experiences, he just wants to listen. And he asks me things like, well, what could I have done in that situation? And so he really does want to learn how to be a great ally. Now, I relate so much to Sylvia's story, because I went from having relationships where I was constantly being told, I do this to make you better, I do this to make you a good person, to suddenly having a partner who's just, I just want to be with you for you. I've been with my partner now for 10 years, and it's not always been the easiest, because he didn't understand mental health either, and actually led to a very bad breakup between us in 2017. And that 2017 is when I decided to start thinking about my mental health and looking after myself, and going into therapy and doing good things for myself. And that's kind of what brought us back together, is because he came back and said, I wasn't ready to understand mental health and it frightened me, but now I realize how important as an ally it is for me to learn. And ever since then, he has been my biggest support system, and he helps me communicate with my family, who don't often understand what the highs and lows of mental health. And he's not perfect, but he sure as heck tries every single day. And he always asks as well, similar to my dad, is what is it that I can do to try and make things easier, or just to help you a little bit? So that's very grateful for that.
Brilliant. Another amazing story. And finally, Anita, for yourself, any relationships that sort of help you, challenge you to think about your mental health or improve your mental health?
So I started, I suppose, my real road to recovery back in 2017. I've done a lot of work, become so much more aware of what works for me, what doesn't, what's unhealthy. And I think a big thing that's come through is blood is not everything. Just because you're related, it does not mean that you have to maintain that relationship, because if it's toxic, if it's unhealthy, if it does you bad, why would you stay with it? You are not bound to anyone. And that was, for me, is the biggest learning. And I think taking back that power in terms of I have control over who I want in my life and how I want them in my life. So the other biggest thing was boundaries. So there are people in my life who I know that I have to put boundaries in place to protect myself, because I've worked way too hard to let that go again. So it's having the boundaries of those individuals and trusting my gut. So when I'm around someone and something doesn't feel right, trust it. And if I need to distance myself, then do it. And I think those are really important in any relationships, be it your family, your friends, your colleagues. It's knowing when that something is bad for you, because it's about protecting your own mental health. You can have the boundaries, you can have everything in place, but if that person is still not, good for you, then remove them, delete them. and it's not always as simple as that, but that for me has been the biggest learning. And then it's also accessing people that I know who are good for me and who are healthy and want the best for me. And it took me a long time to realize that people in my life that I love and are good, they want to be with me for me. when I got diagnosed with endometriosis and then going through fertility, numerous times I said to my husband, you can leave me if you want. You can go, you can find someone else, because I can't give you, you know, what you want to achieve in life. And he was always like, no, that doesn't matter. And it took me a long while to feel comfortable that actually he means it. He wants to be with me and I'm worthy, and it's all those things that play out, you know, all the demons that I've been working on, is accepting it. And it equally, just as you described, Sylvia and Jesse, my husband has been amazing. He's been a rock. When the 6 surgeries, IVF, in and out of a psychiatric hospital for 2 years, he's been there and he's been consistent, and you know, he listens, he's patient, he's kind, and he gives me what I need. And I think for myself, not having parents who are alive, I really depended on him, and I didn't realize how much in my world he meant. And yeah, he's been super amazing. And yeah, and as both as individuals, we've been evolving, learning, having difficult conversations, and understanding each other, and constantly building up that understanding. And you grow as you learn about yourself and together. And yeah, it's been an interesting journey. And yeah, so in terms of relationships, that would be my key thing to anyone, is know when you need to do something different.
Brilliant. Thank you. I know a lot of people sometimes say, where are all the good men? It seems like you've taken them all between your 3.
I'd just like to add one thing though. In the workplace, you know, we talk about in our personal relationships, but in the workplace, one of the biggest relationships that I had in the workplace was from a male boss when I was struggling with my mental health, and then part of that was also being diagnosed with cancer, and being able to actually talk to him openly about that. In the environment that I was in, was very, very difficult for a lot of women to speak to male bosses, male colleagues. But he had something that I would share. He would accept, even if he didn't understand, he would accept. And that's where in the workplace, that relationship was key. And it was interesting, I actually felt more comfortable talking to my male boss at that time because of who he was than it was talking to another woman. And I think it was simply because there was no judgments, there was no opinions. He took what I was telling him on face value and said, then okay, then what can we do? What can I do for you, Sylvia? Then we'll make these adjustments, we'll do this, we'll do that. And that, I think, was the difference. He might not have understood what was going on, but he accepted.
I think that's an amazing thing to mention. Thank you for sharing, you being so accepting. And I guess the reason why I wanted to sort of end on this sort of relationship topic is because life can be hard, but it can be easier when you've got somebody with you. And in these scenarios, it was a partner. However, it doesn't always have to be that person. Like Sylvia said, sometimes it could be a line manager, sometimes it could be a sibling, a friend, anyone who cares and understands. And I guess, the onus is on us to make sure that we become those people and we treat other people with the love and respect that they deserve. And then they feel that they can pass on the love and respect rather than passing on trauma to everyone. Let's just pass on love and respect. I'm just conscious of the time, so I'm going to have to bring this wonderful conversation to a close now. But what I want to do is maybe next 10, 20 seconds each, just one piece of advice that you'd give to women out there of any age to help them take better care of their mental health. So Jessie, we started with yourself. What piece of advice would you give women out there? I'll put you on the spot, sorry.
My biggest piece of advice really is just to not be afraid to have those difficult conversations, because it's in those difficult conversations that you will learn a lot, but also you'll find your heart will make space for the good stuff rather than the stuff you're holding on to.
Thank you. And Sylvia?
Mine would be raise your own self-awareness to understand what your okay position is. So then you can identify when you're starting to slip and then do something about it, have those conversations, do something different, but get to know your okay position.
Thank you. And finally, Anita.
I think just to build on those points is getting support. Therapy, whatever it looks like, is not a weakness. It's actually a strength, because it takes a lot of strength to actually reach out and get the help and talk about all the things that are creating the darkness in your life. So that's what I would say. There's no weakness in getting help.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So big thank you to you three for agreeing to be part of this conversation. Thank you to This Can Happen for allowing us to record this as well. And for anyone that listened to this today, if anything resonated, even if it was a small point that resonated, please do try to work on it, develop it, instill it into your life, and then share with others, because it's by talking to other people about our lives, our experiences, our mental health, our learnings, that we can help other people that might be struggling as well. And that's all from us for today. Thank you.